As we continue then to wait to hear what the pass rate will be for the matric class of 2024. Last year, remember, we were for 2023 at 82.9%. A lot of people waiting to see if that number is going to increase. What can we expect? But from, a number of people who are gathered here, they are expecting that maybe we are going a little higher somewhat. But when you listen to the technical briefing by the Director General of the Department, Matanzima Mweli, you can see that he's happy with the progress in some of the areas, but there are some areas of concern which he's raised as well. And to help us just speak about some of these concerning areas, but also the wins that he talks about that the department has, made and seen over time, we do have Professor Mary Metcalfe, who is with us here in our makeshift studio. Prof, good evening.
Good evening, Bongi. It's good to be here.
And let's just start with just the technical briefing for you and your overall, just reaction to it. Are we in a right direction as a country, or do we still need to do a little bit more?
Well, we're all looking forward to Minister Gwahube making the final announcement in terms of the national and the provincial pass rates. But I think what the DG has is a very difficult task, and that is to show the complexity. Because the easiest takeaway on a headline is the pass rate. But the pass rate explains very little. Provinces perform differently, but provinces are different in terms of size, in terms of the poverty makeup and the wealth makeup of the province, in terms of the resources they have, in terms of their history. So even the provincial comparisons need to be borne in mind when we get the final results. But I agree with you that there is a sense of optimism in what the DG was saying.
While there's a sense of optimism, there's a question, though, that he says still lingers in his mind, is the fact that he's still seeing more female learners enrolling, doing well, and it seems like there's a little bit of, development and also the numbers of boys, the boy children, that remains a concern for him, and he says there's basically an indication that support is needed there. Where do they begin with the support?
Well, generally in terms of our commitments to the Sustainable Development Goals, etc., we are asked to pay attention to the girl learner. If you look at the performance in all of education, not only in the NSC in South Africa, the girl learner is outperforming the boy. Now, the reason that this is an SDG goal is in different countries there's a different culture, different practices in relation to gender. In South Africa, what is clear is that our girls have equal opportunities to young men. The DG indicated that perhaps boys develop later. That may be the case. I'm not familiar with that other than in the early phase of childhood. But what concerns me about the gender analysis is the number of young girls who possibly leave school because of a pregnancy, who do not come back to write, who do not return to school. There is some data in the analysis by gender of people writing later in their 20s. And I need to look at that to see if girls are overrepresented in their 20s in writing part-time. Because that would mean that despite the setback of having a child with all of the joy, but also the challenges that brings, whether young women are coming back to write their National Senior Certificate.
Let's look at this cohort of matriculants. They would have started school in 2013. At the height of COVID, they're in grade 8. In 2020, there's lockdowns and all of that. But the department says that things improve somewhat for them and they're benefiting from much more of a learner support. But interestingly, when you look at their set of circumstances, is that they would have benefited more from, progression policies? Is that a good thing?
Okay, so there's two questions there. The first is, what is the impact of COVID on this group? And I would say that being out of school in that transition year into high school must be devastating, because they were in grade 8 in 2020. So that would have been a very sad introduction to high school, a very sad transition. And in 2021, they would have been alternating. So 8 and 9 as grades in the South African education system, in my view, are under-supported and a bit marginalized. So that would have been a setback. What encourages me to not worry that that may have had catastrophic effects on this group is because the last two cohorts of the NSC actually both had an improvement. Perhaps without COVID they would have improved more, but those two groups improved. Now, the impact of the progression policy, this is something that isn't necessarily well understood by the South African public. We have compulsory education now from the year in which you turn 6 until the year in which you turn 15. If you are a learner who needs more time to get through the curriculum and therefore needs to fail, there has to be a balance between failing and holding learners back so that they are many years older than their classmates. Holding learners back who need to fail means that you might have a learner who's 10-year-old, but they're with 7-year-olds. And immediately, socially, people can identify that that's a problem. It's a problem for the teachers, it's a problem for the learners, and it's very bad for self-concept. So the solution to that is the progression policy which South Africa introduces, which I think is better than multiple failures that set a learner so far back that they were very young children. And the progression policy that was introduced that this group would have been affected by is that you can only fail once in a phase. One phase is foundation phase, which is grade R now to grade 3. You can only fail one of those grades. So teachers have to judiciously choose what is in the learner's best interests based on my understanding of this learner's social circumstances, and they may fail a learner in grade 1 or they may decide to hold them back in grade 3. So this group is interesting because what the progression data within the National Senior Certificate shows us is that learners who've progressed to write the matric often do very well. So a judgment that a learner isn't ready to progress, there's possibilities of the learner coping. So this cohort would only have been allowed to fail once in a phase.
You're talking about this issue that's always very interesting each and every single year, the issue of progression policies. And you were explaining, and some parents do understand, Prof, what you have to say, but others say that why do you need to progress someone that for, me as a parent, I still see it as a failure, and I'm worried that as the more you take them to the next grade, they're not ready for the amount of work and the maturity that is required with each grade.
When a learner is progressed, both the teachers know as well as the family. And I think that must send a strong message to both the new teacher receiving that child and the family that extra support is required. It does place more demands on the teacher in particular, but I would argue that the increased demands of older learners who continue to have learning difficulties, but also the social consequences. Many people underestimate that one of the biggest difficulties of being a teacher is actually just management of the social, management of relationships in the class, management of keeping attention. And if you have such a socially diverse, age-diverse group, it brings its own problems. Obviously, in an economy that's thriving, where we can afford to have smaller classes, where we can afford to have more remedial support one-on-one with children, that would be ideal. Until then, we continue to depend on our fabulous teachers, but teachers can succeed if families are also playing their part.
What is your sense when you look at over time? Because there is this issue every year, it comes up with those who start grade 1 but are not being tracked through to grade 12. You know, a lot of people say we don't know where they are. Do you think, the department is doing better when it comes to that data and the management of it thereof and the processing to know how many of these children, for example, would be at a TVET college, how many of them would have dropped out, how many, whatever would have happened to that learner who would have started grade 1? Are they doing better in managing that data?
I don't think that we as a country are doing well enough in managing that data. The DBE, in response to criticisms of poor data around retention, has produced a table in the technical report, which we all saw. And they also produce what they call an inclusive basket. Now, I've often wondered how they calculate the inclusive basket, but the inclusive basket uses the concept of retention. And the retention that's used there, for example, is that in last year's NSC, Limpopo had the highest retention rate of 72%. This year, it's the Western Cape that has the highest retention rate. Now, retention rate, if it is the number of learners from the original cohort who have made it to matric, it in itself becomes a very interesting statistic, because some of the most highly performing provinces have the lowest retention rates, and some of the more less well-performing provinces have higher retention rates. And clearly then, in the analysis, we need to have a critical look at provinces who are keeping their learners and perhaps not getting such a good NSC overall rate, but they're getting more learners to stay in school with a sense of hope. Now, I'm not certain that the rates that we're getting as the retention rate in the DBE's inclusive basket are absolutely accurate. And there is data both available within the DBE and in some of the NGOs that track this, that use household survey data, etc., because we know, and I've got the figure here and I want to give it, is the number of, I won't give it, but the number of learners who we call NEET, not in education, not in employment, not in training, in South Africa, under the age of 28, is extraordinarily high. That is what must drive our conception of inclusion, and it must also drive our sense of a system that articulates between higher education and basic, TVET and school.
Quite interesting set of thoughts there, and you think about the fact that enrollment in business studies is also still another issue of concern.